out to me. He's a Dowagiac native. His father is my golfing partner, so it's a natural fit for us to have Anthony here tonight. Anthony is a faculty member at the American Musical and Dramatic Academy College of the Performing Arts in Los Angeles, California. This particular program fit perfectly in his schedule because he was home for 6 weeks. He's leaving for Los Angeles, right? You live in LA? You live in LA?
No.
So he's leaving town this weekend, so timing worked out perfectly. He teaches and researches there at the intersection of art and politics. He has a Ph.D. and MA in political science from Western Michigan and MA in international relations from the University of Manchester, England, and received a postdoctoral certificate in American Studies at the Universitat LaSalle. Did I do all right with that? In Germany. I do have some German background, so in my lineage. His published works include the book An Introduction to the Social and Political Philosophy of Brecht, Revolution and Aesthetics, a co-edited volume, Philosophizing Brecht, Critical Readings on Art, Consciousness, Social Theory, and Performance, and the book For Politics of the Sacred in America, the Role of Civil Religion in Political Practice. He's also published poetry. He's a theater critic, fiction writer of short stories, play scripts, and the novel Madness and Insanity. He is here to talk about this book tonight, The Glorious Departure of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, Eulogies and Remembrances from America's Great Orators. The Adams-Jefferson relationship is one of my favorite stories in American history, and he's going to tell you all about it tonight. This book he has available tonight, his publisher is actually here tonight in the back, and he's filming this tonight. He will be selling this book. It is normally $32. Tonight, special $25 if you're interested in purchasing a copy and having it signed by the author tonight. So without further ado, Anthony Squiers.
Well, thank you all for being here. I'm honored to be amongst you. Few events in American history have captured the public imagination as much as the unlikely deaths of two of its most venerated patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, on the same day, July 4th, 1826. If a significant person such as these national figureheads dies, people reflect. His significance seems to demand as much. If two die separately on the same day, it's easy to imagine that there would be considerable reflection. This would especially be the case if they are two of the most noteworthy national figures of their day, as Adams and Jefferson were. They were founders of the nation, former vice presidents, diplomats, statesmen, and revolutionary writers whose words inspired a new nation to form. It should not be surprising then that their deaths would provoke an extraordinary amount of national reflection. But if you couple all of this with the fact that they died on the 50th anniversary of the day set aside to commemorate the nation's founding and the nation's founding document, the Declaration of Independence, a document the deceased were responsible for creating, you have something truly remarkable. You have the ingredients for the making of a national myth. As the 200th anniversary of this unique event approaches, this volume of eulogies and remembrances of Adams and Jefferson have been compiled. This is the first reprinting of these texts in nearly 2 centuries and includes venerations composed by some of the most influential American statesmen and public voices of the 19th century, senators, representatives, justices, even a soon-to-be president, and other individuals at the highest levels of social and political power. All the entries have been chosen for their poetic and rhetorical beauty and their historical significance. These commemorations provide a treasure trove of insights into the history of the American Revolution, the early Republic, including the Continental Congress, early diplomatic missions, early partisan politics, and more, all with these figures at the center stage. Moreover, they allow the students of history to re-examine this unique moment in the American past to understand its role in shaping the story Americans tell themselves about their origin and to understand their political union. But what is that story? And what role did this event have in shaping it? In order to answer these questions, it's helpful to start by looking a little closer to our own time. Even the most casual observers of American politics will be used to hearing sentiments like this one from President Obama in his 2012 Democratic nomination acceptance speech. He says, "We the people recognize that we have responsibilities as well as rights, that our destinies are bound together, that a freedom which asks only what's in it for me, a freedom without commitment to others, a freedom without love or charity or duty or patriotism, is unworthy of our founding ideals and those who died in their defense." Or this one from President Reagan in his 1984 Republican nomination acceptance speech. "Isn't our choice really not one of left or right, but of up or down? Down through the welfare state to statism, to more and more government largesse, accompanied always by more government authority. The alternative is the dream conceived by our founding fathers, up to the ultimate and individual freedom consistent with an orderly society." At the center of both of these examples lies a profound devotion to the founding fathers and their ideas. This type of respect for a people's ancestors is something sociologists refer to as filial piety, and it's deeply entrenched in American political rhetoric. It seems that the first recorded use of the term, the founding fathers, was in 1916 by former President and at the time Senator Warren G. Harding. In a keynote address to the Republican National Convention, he exhorted the audience to be, quote, "as genuinely American today as when the founding fathers flung their immortal defiance in the face of cold world oppressions and dedicated a new republic to liberty and justice." While Harding may have coined the term, his lofty oration wasn't actually all that original. In fact, Harding was following a rather well-worn path in American political rhetoric. Half a century earlier, President Lincoln, for example, gave his famous Gettysburg Address saying, "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." Both Lincoln's and Harding's speeches invoked the founding fathers in order to rouse their compatriots to action. For Harding, the action was to be genuinely American today. In order to continue the task of liberty and justice began by the founding fathers. For Lincoln, it was, quote, to, quote, "take increased devotion to a new birth of freedom, so that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth." Both speakers intractably link the founding fathers to the concepts of freedom and equality. In effect, they argue that these themes are where the mission of the founding fathers, and their audiences should follow that spirit. In short, both Lincoln and Harding call on their audiences to follow through on what their ancestors started. This notion can be traced back even further than Lincoln. In fact, it goes back to the Revolutionary period. In his classic work on the subject, historian Wesley Craven has shown that at the time of the Revolution, people in the colonies were already attributing, quote, the very ideas we associate with the Revolutionary Fathers, for example, the establishment of a new order of human freedom, to the Puritans. This notion was a key component of revolutionary rhetoric. Liberty was seen as an inheritance from the Puritan fathers that must be fought for and more fully realized so that their sacrifices were not in vain. John Adams himself made an argument along these same lines in his influential dissertation on the canon and feudal law. In it, he argues that the colonists should resist the Stamp Act and other forms of, quote, arbitrary government and tyranny because their history was defined by, quote, the endeavor at confining the power of the great within the limits of equity and reason. From the time of the first settlement of America, he argued, knowledge had gradually spread so that as that increased and spread among the people, ecclesiastical and civil tyranny had been losing their strength and weight. In essence, he was encouraging his contemporaries to keep up the fight for freedom their Puritan ancestors started. As we can see, the people who Americans now consider founding fathers had their own conception of founding fathers. However, although many of the elements we see in the examples from Lincoln and Harding can be found in sentiments like those of Adams and others at the time of the Revolution, they obviously reference an entirely different set of heroes. For Lincoln and Harding, as with Reagan and Obama after them, the founding fathers meant the Revolutionary Fathers. But to the Revolutionary Fathers, it meant the Puritan Fathers. At some point in American history, then, a new set of national heroes emerged. But when? History is fluid, and present realities have many causes that unfold over periods of time. But with this in mind, the documents compiled here, however, demonstrate that the near simultaneous deaths of Adams and Jefferson on the 50th Independence Day, America's most important civic holiday, a day that celebrates what many Americans believe is, as Ph.D. put it, quote, the most important day, politically speaking, that the world has ever seen, had a significant impact on that transformation. Taken together, they reveal a new national story emerging, which comprises significant elements that could not predate this moment. These new, previously unavailable elements were built upon the foundations of an already existing national story, in much the same way that the New Testament builds upon the Old. Such a profound alteration of the national myth, just as the one I just described, doesn't happen often in the history of people. Then again, unlikely events such as those observed on the 4th of July, 1826, don't either. The totality of the circumstances surrounding the deaths of the two led many orators to conclude it was all too improbable to be just a coincidence. Something like this, they thought, had to be divine intervention. When was the hand of providence more clearly seen than in the close of their eventful lives, asked John Shaw. The hand of God was seen by all, declared Samuel L. Knapp. And C.C. Chamberlain exclaimed that it was as if the mighty ruler of the universe, from his radiant throne on high, had deigned to smile on their rejoicings and to bless their jubilee. Similarly, Sheldon Smith proclaimed, "Let no cold, calculating philosophy attempt to ascribe such an unheard of coincidence to natural causes. Stupid must be the mortal who does not see in the deaths of Jefferson and Adams the hand of that being who controls the destinies of man." In addition to seeing divine intervention through the deaths, many inferred an apotheosis, or an elevation to a divine-like status for the pair. Caleb Cushing claimed, "The heroic and patriotic men shot upward in our sky like a meteor, and they had ascended to heaven." According to Peleg Sproul, their ascent could hardly have been more glorious. Daniel Webster announced that the heavens had opened up to receive them both at once. The circumstances surrounding their deaths bestowed on them, as Cushing put it, a rare immortality. Deathless be the names of Jefferson and Adams, declared Sheldon Smith. And Peleg Sproul contended, their names will go down with unfading glory to future ages. Indeed, in these reflections, we see the men taking on a sacred quality. According to John Sargent, death has thus placed his seal upon the lives of these two eminent men with impressive solemnity. Sheldon Smith exclaimed that their names shall be a talismanic watchword. The Orators compiled in this edition also saw in the event the divinely sanctioned unification of two men who had once been leaders of rival political factions. These factions were so hostile to each other. Think about how hostile we are today, right? Similar thing, right? These factions were so hostile to each other that at times the rivalry looked like it could destroy the country. In their later years, however, the two reconciled and frequently wrote each other affectionate letters. This personal reconciliation combined with this seemingly cosmic connection of their deaths helped to create the impression that whatever it was that divided them was far less significant than that which united them. It was as if God was making a special point to emphasize what united them. Chamberlain exclaimed, "They died together, let them be forever united in our memories. Those whom God hath so wonderfully united, it would be impious to put asunder." The idea of a divine unification extended beyond the link between Jefferson and Adams. The seemingly divine sanction that united them through the coincidence of their deaths on Independence Day also unified them, in Henry Potter's words, that lofty monument which their labors have erected, and other figures who had a hand in it. As Sargent stated, they have been united in death, and they have both, in a most signal manner, been associated with the great event which they so largely contributed to produce. Moreover, other orators stressed, for example, the idea that the two had now joined the already fallen, like Franklin and Washington. The latter, Knapp called the first great martyr of liberty. The, quote, glory of these men, which Jefferson and Adams are now associated with in heaven, according to Sargent, is a precious possession, enriching our annals and exalting the character of our country. The singularity and implausibility of this event, as well as the predisposition to view things in religious terms, led the eulogists to bestow on Jefferson and Adams an extra-worldly, supernatural quality which forever bound each to the other, and both to Independence Day and all those who played a role in its realization. As Alfred Johnson Jr. put it, from this time the currents of their respective histories have become united in one. From this period, the history of one is the history of his country and of the other. In the minds of our orators, their deaths sanctified them, the cause for which they struggled, and the revolutionary co-conspirators who aided them to success. In this way, an American pantheon began to emerge, populated by political gods, worthy figures whose songs would now be sung into the nation's sorrow. As we just heard, Adams and others at the time of the Revolution framed the Revolution as a stage in the project of human freedom first envisioned by the Puritans. The narrative of this Puritan errand into the wilderness, as Samuel Danforth called it, was a historically persistent one, and a motif the orators in this collection gravitated for. It was an established national historical narrative, in a sense the Old Testament of the American saga. And as such, it was a ready-made framework for understanding revolutionary heroes. According to Dewar, the Puritans had been induced to seek in the wilds of this newly discovered continent an asylum from religious and political intolerance. They had an inflexible love of civil and religious liberty. According to Joseph Eastray, and their, quote, principles of liberty, he argued, had been implanted by the Puritans in their descendants. But the remembrances collected here reveal much more than the application of a traditional historical trope. They reveal the idea of a new stage in the national saga, the idea that the errand of human freedom inherited from the Puritans had been better realized. This new stage in the history is its New Testament. It is a New Testament that claims to bear witness to wondrous, holy feats performed by the Revolutionary Fathers and canonizes the Declaration of Independence. According to the Declaration of Independence, which was penned by Jefferson in committee with Adams, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive to the ends of the self-evident truths of all men being created equal and being endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, such as life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, it's the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new government. In other words, the Declaration of Independence argues that the will of some divine creator God grants people certain rights: equality, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. People freely enter into a contract, according to the Declaration, with each other, establishing governments for the purpose of ensuring those rights. This is why government exists, according to the logic of the Declaration of Independence. If the government doesn't ensure those rights, the people have a right to get rid of it and do another, form another government. The Declaration then goes on to list all the ways the author felt his government was inhibiting the people's ability to enjoy the rights this Creator God intended them to enjoy. These violations then served as justification for the rebellion, the pronouncement of independence, and formation of a new government. According to Potter, the Declaration's pronouncement was, quote, a sort of epic point in the great political drama. It was all light, all strength, all truth, said William Johnson, and was, in Sargent's words, now a nation's creed. This, quote, immortal instrument, said William Thornton, was so grand in its design, so bold in its execution, and so monumentous in its consequences, that it soars above all the deeds of man. Its creed was proselytized by Adams and Jefferson, the, quote, apostles of a new political faith, as Robert R. Johnson referred to them. They were, according to Cushing, apostles of liberty who propagated the universal dissemination of the grand principles of civil and religious freedom. Because of them, declared Felix Grundy, all eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man. They spread, in Sargent's words, the, quote, sacred principles, which had been solemnly inscribed upon the banner of the Revolution. Not surprisingly, our orators believed such a holy crusade must have God on its side. God was with them. Yes, my friends, he was on our side, pronounced Grundy. Sargent declared that the God of battles had crowned our country's cause with victory. Not only did the orators see the hand of God in the dust of the hands of Jefferson and in the success of the Revolution, they saw it in the entire history of the country. According to Dewar, no true American capable of reflection can mediate upon the events of the last half-century without feeling that his country has enjoyed the particular favor of the supreme governor of the world. The favors of a gracious providence, said Sargent, have been so often manifested in mercy to our country. The reason for believing in God's favor can be found on the reverse of the Great Seal of the United States, which has its origins during the Revolutionary period. There, one finds two phrases written in Latin. Annuit coitus, which means he, referring to God, has favored our undertaking. And Novus Ordo Seclorum, or New Order of the Ages. The first denotes God's favor, the second the reason for the favor. America's good deed, the establishment of a new political order founded on principles of freedom. The orators in this collection saw this as a gift to the world, the auspicious commencement of the political salvation of the world, according to Alfred Johnson. According to Duer, it secured our own freedom and offered to the oppressed of other nations and of other times an example. And John Tyler claimed, the happy era shall arrive for the emancipation of nations, hastened on, as it will be by the example of America. A superstitious impulse to attribute natural causes to supernatural forces turned a moment already ripe for national reflection into something seemingly more profound. What we see in these eulogies is the lionization of two men to epic and hyperbolic proportions. They are granted heroic, godlike statuses whose exploits take on an otherworldly, universal historical significance. In them, they become more than people. They become sacred symbols or totems for the American people. They become national icons and saints to be emulated. Like them, keep at all times the brilliant star of liberty steadily in view, implored Samuel Smith. Let there be no limits to your zeal for these hallowed principles bequeathed to you by those illustrious men who marshaled you to freedom. The writers in this anthology took their message of the new American Testament and spread it widely. They were, after all, the nation's most renowned orators. They were celebrities. They were commanding public voices who had audiences filling halls and churches to hear them, and mainstream media clamoring to print and sell their words. The ubiquity and the unity of their voices helped to make their version of American history the politically correct version and to cement it as a rhetorical element in American political parlance. These voices shape the dominant historical narrative or mythology of a people. This is a mythology which, as the quotes from Reagan and Obama attest to, still persists in our own time. It is a mythology that gave birth to the modern conception of the Founding Fathers by turning the Revolutionary Fathers into the Founding Fathers and bestowing on them apostolic status in what sociologist Robert Bellah called the American civil religion, which is a collection of beliefs, rituals, and symbols that maintain unity and cohesion in the nation. With the mythic origins of the Founding Fathers now laid before us, we should take a moment to reflect critically on their stories presented to us by the orators in this anthology. In these writings, in addition to great oratory and compelling first-hand historical accounts, the reader will at times encounter blatant betrayals of logic, bitter ironies, and contortions of empirical fact. Principal among this is the idea that the Founding Fathers could really symbolize one discernible intention. In political rhetoric, one often hears people attempting to legitimize their positions by saying it's what the Founding Fathers intended, or what they wanted. But to what extent can an intention be reconstructed from the actions of a group of religiously, politically, philosophically, regionally diverse individuals who are all pursuing their own ends, often at cross purposes, mind you, operating on their own assumptions, and who are forced to barter and make compromises with each other to get anything done? Or how unified could the Founding Fathers really be if this notion encompasses Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton? The former killed the latter in a pistol duel fueled by personal and political animosities, yet somehow they're united in the same symbol. Furthermore, the idea of the Puritan founding being about religious freedom is equally problematic. It is true that these people came to the continent looking to exercise their own religion freely, but they had no interest in allowing the free exercise of other religions. Quakers, Baptists, for example, would question the notion of religious freedom since they were all victims of religious repression and persecution at the hands of the Puritans. Now, this isn't to suggest that Adams and Jefferson and other founding fathers didn't have some great ideas. The best among them were major advancements in human history. But these individuals were not divine, as the words of the orators in this collection suggest. They were human and they were fallible. We must recognize this and resist the sheepish devotion to them and whatever principles one may try to ascribe to them. There are many historical examples of sacred principles being necessarily cast aside to make space for social progress. They have been discarded and discredited, rightly rejected, and justly shunned. These things we now call myths, illusions, falsehoods. If the entire recorded history of the world is any indication of future events, one day American beliefs about the founding fathers will, like the myths of the past, be chucked onto the trash pile heap of antiquated and false beliefs. We have had 200 additional years of political and social sciences and normative philosophy since the time of the founding fathers. There have been major technological innovations that have fundamentally changed our society. There is now the emergence of new types of problems on scales the founding fathers could hardly contemplate. A devotion to them, such as the one called for at the time of the deaths of Jefferson and Adams, is very restrictive. It could limit the country's ability to take the necessary steps it needs in order to progress and to adapt to new challenges as a nation. But this doesn't mean that we can't find inspiration from these figures or that we couldn't find new inspiration in them. Indeed, the readings collected here reveal several avenues in this regard that have special relevance for today. They disclose some ideas that have been seemingly lost and are begging for rescue. For example, in an age where people serving only the interests of the rich attack science and empirical facts, attack educators and public education, we can be inspired by the notion captured so eloquently by Daniel Webster. Quote, the cause of knowledge, in a more enlarged sense, the cause of general knowledge and of popular education, had no warmer friends, no more powerful advocates than Mr. Adams and Mr. Jefferson. On this foundation, they knew the whole Republican system rested, and this great and all-important truth they strove to impress by all the means in their power. Or, in an age of great economic inequality that injures a fair and meaningful competition of interest in the democratic process, we might recall that in Grundy's words, quote, while a member of the Virginia Assembly, in order to prevent the accumulation of large masses of property in single families, Jefferson led the march toward breaking down the entailments of landed estates and destroying the right of primogeniture. This measure was designed and calculated to produce the great end, that the few should not rule and oppress the many. Thank you.
Questions?
Just a lot. Just a lot. I want to be first. Yeah.
How should we do the questions?
How do you want to do it? Raise a hand and call on somebody?
If Biden and Trump died on the same day.
Jubilation!
Very good. A lot of religious significance.
It's hard to say. Yes.
First of all, thank you, Anthony. My gosh, what an amount of work that goes into this. And it shows me you're up here and somewhere down here. But I would like to know, and this, maybe this is delving too far from the subject of the book. I would like to know your inspiration on what drew you to put this all together, and how did that come about, and how do you go about it? I mean, that's a lot of work. Can you share that part of your creative process with us?
Sure.
Okay.
So it was in 2012, I was sat watching the election returns come in. And I was kind of flipping through different channels to see what different people were saying, just because I study a lot political rhetoric and this kind of stuff. And I heard, somebody say something on, one station, the founding fathers and their wisdom, this kind of stuff set up this system. And then I flipped the channel, and a few minutes later, I heard a certain, something that echoed that. And I was like, oh yeah, people are always talking about the founding fathers and this kind of thing. And so it was this interest in the way that the founding fathers is used as a kind of a symbol or a sign in political rhetoric. And I wrote another book, this was prior to this, called The Politics of the Sacred in America, which looks at political rhetoric in America, like these quotes on the founding fathers that I just showed you. And, basically, that was how I got interested, was like looking at them as a sign. And as part of the prior book, I had kind of encountered this and some of these texts that I was working with, and I wanted to do something a little more in depth with the desks themselves, because that was only just a very small portion of the previous book.
Okay, and this is an anthology,
Yes.
and you chose from all these different writings and put them together how? What is the organization of the book? I mean, there's lots of different ways to go about it. Chronological, or do you pick a topic and then delve into that? Or do you, how do you use the writings of other people and put them together?
Well, my strategy was to try to get a certain flow for the reader. Right? So, but it also, for example, has some kind of reference material that's in there that would, for example, there's a note on the text, so where the original text came from, where it was published, and these kinds of things. The dates that it was, the date that the oration was given, and where it was given, and stuff like that. So for those who are interested in kind of the nuts and bolts historical thing, there's additional information, as well as, short biographical information about who the orators were. Yeah.
Does it do any bouncing back and forth between today's situations and where it was back then, or it is not that kind of book?
Well, it's all historical documents that were, the orators were giving these eulogies right at, within a few weeks or days of finding out that, because it took a long time, by the way. We forget that, but this was, people took those messages on horses,
You mentioned a little bit about how Adams and Jefferson were leaders of two different parties that had a lot of animosity between them. And as time went on, then they found more ways to unite and let go that which divided them. But could you just tell us a little bit about the two parties and how they saw things differently, and as time went on, which one prevailed?
Well, actually that predates the party's system. They were just kind of, so one of the big things was that, Jefferson did the Louisiana Purchase, and they thought that this was a massive expansion of federal power, and that it should have never happened, and that kind of thing. I'm not necessarily an expert in 19th century political policy, but a lot of it had to do with kind of conceptualizations of the role of government.
would you say that Adams was more for stronger federal government? Because I always thought of Jefferson as being more for states' rights.
Right.
And yet Jefferson went on to purchase the Louisiana Purchase, which was a huge federal power grab, so to speak. How would they have discussed that? How would Adams have said that should have been taken care of, as opposed to the way that Jefferson did it?
Let's be honest, I'm not exactly sure.
Okay.
It's probably a pretty nuanced issue.
Debate.
That I feel like any kind of answer that I could give you probably wouldn't satisfy you correctly. Yes?
Have you looked at the orations after George Washington died? Because I'm sure there was a lot of veneration.
There, actually, I have. There's not as many that survive. But actually, several of the orators in this collection reference one of the famous ones that was given to Washington. And, Washington himself plays quite prominently here as well. A lot of linking these two to Washington. And, all of the Revolutionary fathers, but Washington in particular. It's quite clear that there was a very high reverence towards Washington, even while he was alive. He was quite well regarded. Yes?
I'm not sure my memory serves correct. Isn't one of the last things Adams said was at least Jefferson survives? Not knowing that Jefferson actually had died. Obviously he didn't know, but.
Yeah, that's the people that were in the room with him at the time said that was it. He was sort of not feeling well and kind of, in and out of sleeping, and then at some point he woke up and he made this comment about Jefferson surviving. I think he knew that it was, he'd been ill, and actually Jefferson had died by a few hours earlier.
Yes, I know.
No one knew that there. Yes.
How old was each man when he died?
Oh, that's a good question. I'd have to look that up. But they were, they were up there, especially for the
comparable age when they were going through all of these things that they went through.
Yeah, Adams, I believe, was a few years older.
Adams was older. I believe Adams was older.
Yeah,
I don't know how many years.
I think he was a few years older, but they were during the Revolutionary period. They were young men. They were young men.
In any of your research on what the orators were saying, because you mentioned how there's almost a connection with divine intervention. I was always amazed in the War of 1812 when the British were basically burning the White House, how that tornado and hurricane and everything went through. That had to be almost considered divine intervention, because they had us on the run, and it's like God himself came down and just threw that storm out. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that.
That's what I wondered if any of the orators mentioned
But
that.
it's funny, right? So it's always like, divine intervention when it works out for you.
I don't know, when I play the lottery, I say it's divine intervention against me.
Yeah, that's not unique to American history as well. I mean, if you read, Homer or whatever, that there's always,
The Spanish Armada.
Spanish Armada, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, divine intervention is right into all sorts of things. Yeah.
God's just playing with us.
The quotes that you compiled and researched all seem to be just very glowing and putting them up in the divine area where today I think it wouldn't matter who died in politics. There'd be somebody out there just Okay, no, okay.
No, I don't think at that time that you would, I mean, I'm sure that there are people that have opinions that were contrary to what these people thought, right? I mean, they were talking, you know, the politically correct talk, the way that, you know, the way that people were supposed to talk, and, you know, framing it in a way that their audience would, you know, expect, and that kind of thing. But I truly believe that at that time, that a lot of people, not just the orators, but a lot of people, you know, had good things to think about and to say about these two figures.
So you knew you wanted to do a book about 2012, you said? When did you start on the project?
This particular project I started, well, because it's hard to say, because around 2013 or something, I was kind of compiling some of these things, doing the research for the previous book, and I just, you know, kind of put them aside, and they sat for years and years and years. And, about a year ago, or a little more than a year ago, I guess, I decided I should do something with it, and especially because, you know, in a few years we'll have the 200th anniversary of this, and I think that people might want to re-look at this event. And also, you know, some of the language in it, it's antiquated language, and the references are quite obscure, so I annotated it a lot. And they, you know, they were doing a lot of, like, you know, quoting in Latin and this kind of stuff, and I was like,
That's not today's American, is it?
no, but I translated, I had those translated, so.
So then how did you know when you were done? There, that's it, that's what I wanted, I'm done with it. Or did your public?
First it did, publisher, I always feel like that I'm never done, but at some point you just have to say that it's done.
Oh, okay.
Did any of your books come from the result of an extension of your doctoral dissertation?
Yes, my first academic book my first academic book was my dissertation. It's on the social and political philosophy of the German playwright Bertolt Brecht. So that was one of them, yeah. My Ph.D. is in political science, but my focus within that was in political philosophy. But so I was trained both as a political philosopher, but also as a political scientist.
What's your academic background? I mean, where did you go to school?
I went to Western Michigan University
For your PhD?
for my PhD.
Where did you find most of this information? I mean, you must have had a lot of sources, but like Library of Congress, or what was your most prolific place to find information?
What I did was I found some magazines that were from that era that had lists of books that they had received, and that they had received for review. They would do like these book reviews and this kind of thing, but they wouldn't always do a book review, but they would always list the books, the books that were sent to them and available out there, and with information on the publisher. So I found a few, I went to archives, and I found these lists. And then I started finding these sources, the original sources, off of these lists that I found in the back of these magazines. That was kind of my methodology.
How did you do this, on the computer?
Yeah. A lot of it was, there was maybe one or two documents that I had found online some indication that they existed, at least at one point that they existed, and ended up tracking them down in obscure like archives, but most of them were pretty not too hard to track down. A few were kind of tricky, but not too bad. And actually, about a year after they died, somebody, a publisher at the time, compiled a bunch of them too. So I knew from this compilation of a bunch of them, and then I knew also from this list of the existence. And there was, I think that there might be one or two that I learned of their existence, but was not able to ever track down. I don't know if that means that they don't exist anymore, or I don't know.
Wow.
I tried really hard to find them and I couldn't do it, so I felt like I gave it the my best shot.